Alabama, August 13th, 1846. The air was thick that night, not with rain, but with something older, heavier, something that made even the crickets go silent. In the town of Lowndes County, a single lantern burned in the window of the Carter plantation house, casting long shadows that looked more alive than the people inside. Thomas Carter sat at the oak table, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from decision. The ink on the paper before him glistened under candlelight, like blood refusing to dry. Outside, two small boys slept in the quarters behind the main house, unaware that their father was about to trade them away. Not for money, not for land, but for a girl. Before we descend any further, make sure you've claimed your place in this circle. Subscribe now, press the bell so you never miss what follows, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing this voice from. The world needs to know who's awake. A girl named Abeni, no more than 16, who had been taken from the Ivory Coast, shipped across the ocean, and sold 3 times before she arrived here. She did not speak English. She did not smile. She was property, like the horses or the house itself. And yet, to Thomas, she was something different, something that clawed into his mind, something that made him lose all sense of blood, name, and God. The deal was whispered, not written. In the dark corners of Montgomery, men met to arrange trades no court would recognize. Trades of lineage, trades of power, trades of flesh. And tonight, Thomas Carter's soul had a price. They say when he signed that parchment, the candle beside him flickered out for no reason. The ink ran down the page like veins spreading across skin, and though no one saw it, the moment the seal touched wax, something in the bloodline broke. A silence fell that would stretch through generations. Abeni was brought to the house before dawn. The boys were taken away before sunrise. And the deal, the one whispered among planters and preachers alike, became a curse none of them would ever speak of again. But in the swamps behind that land, when the mist rolls low, locals say you can still hear a woman's voice calling out the names of 2 lost sons, names that were never written, only traded. And it all began that night, the night Alabama forgot God. Morning came without light. The sky hung low and gray, as if it refused to watch what had been done. The Carter estate, once alive with the noise of workers and horses, now felt hollow, as if the earth itself had inhaled and never exhaled again. Thomas walked through the corridors of his house like a man trapped inside his own reflection. Every portrait stared at him, his father, his grandfather, the long chain of men whose names carried weight across Alabama soil. But something in those painted eyes had changed. He could feel it. They no longer looked like ancestors. They looked like witnesses. Abeni stood at the far end of the hall, bare feet, torn dress, eyes dark as still water. She did not cry. She did not speak. She only watched him, as if she already knew the price of his desire. That night, Thomas burned the contract, or thought he did, but the ashes refused to die. They drifted in the air like black snow, clinging to the curtains, the floor, his skin. Each flake whispered something he couldn't understand, a language older than English, older than guilt. For days, he tried to return to the rhythm of the plantation, overseeing crops, disciplining workers, pretending everything was as it was. But the rhythm was gone. The land itself had changed. The cotton wilted faster. The wells turned cloudy. And when he looked at Abeni, he saw something behind her, shadows that didn't belong to the light. One night, the housekeeper, old Miss Ruth, came trembling to his door. "Sir," she said, voice breaking, "that girl, she don't sleep. She hums." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean, hums?" Ruth's eyes widened. "It ain't a song, sir. It's a call, like she's calling someone home." That night, Thomas followed the sound. Through the dark halls, past the shuttered windows, out toward the swamp, where the mist licked the ground like smoke from a dying fire. And there she was, standing knee-deep in black water, humming a tune that made the air vibrate with something ancient. He called her name. She turned, and in that moment he saw it. Two faint shapes in the mist behind her, small, childlike, watching him. He stepped forward once. The water rippled red, and the humming stopped.
They say evil doesn't announce itself. It seeps, slow, invisible, like humidity before a storm. And in the weeks that followed, that's exactly what spread through the Carter plantation. The air changed first. Workers began to complain that the mornings felt heavier, like the dawn itself was pressing against their chests. Animals refused to drink from the troughs. Dogs howled at shadows before vanishing into the fields. And every night, from the direction of the swamp, came that same low hum, like a lullaby meant for no living child. Thomas tried to bury himself in routine. He told himself it was guilt, nothing more, that the unease was his own imagination punishing him for what he had done. But then came the voices, soft at first, then closer, then inside. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing two boys whispering just beyond his door. He would rush to open it. Nothing. Only the faint smell of wet earth, like the swamp had followed him home. The servants began to leave, one by one, without word or pay. They said they saw shapes in the window at dawn, two small hands pressed against the glass from the inside, where no one stood. But Abeni, she never left. She wandered the house barefoot, her eyes always following him. Sometimes she would sit at the piano pressing keys at random, but every time, no matter how scattered the notes, the melody became the same, a mother's lament. One night, Thomas confronted her. "What are you?" he demanded. Abeni tilted her head, slow, deliberate. "What you traded," she said. And when she smiled, he saw, for the first time, the reflection of two children standing behind her, their faces blurred by fog. That night, the last of the staff fled. The fields went untended. The estate began to rot from the inside out. And in the heart of it all, Thomas Carter sat alone, staring at his trembling hands, realizing too late that what he'd bartered away was not sons, not flesh, but the soul of his entire bloodline. They say his laughter echoed through the swamp before turning into something else, a sound no man could name. By autumn, the Carter name had already begun to rot. Neighbors whispered that Thomas had gone mad, that he'd sealed off the second floor, nailed shut the windows, and spoken only to the girl, the one who moved like smoke and never blinked. They said he'd stopped attending church, that the preacher came once, left pale as milk, and never returned. And when asked why, the old man simply said, "That house doesn't belong to men anymore." Inside, time no longer moved in straight lines. Thomas would wake at dawn to find the clocks frozen, the fire still burning though he hadn't lit it. The mirrors began to ripple when he walked past, as if the reflections refused to follow him anymore. And through it all, Abeni watched. Sometimes she stood by the window for hours, her lips moving in silent prayer. Other times she'd hum that same wordless melody until the air itself began to shiver. He asked her what it meant. She said, "It means the blood remembers." One evening, as the last of the light drained from the horizon, Thomas found himself drawn back to the swamp. The air there was thick, humming, alive. He felt pulled by something deep beneath the soil, something calling from below. The water reflected the moon like a shard of glass, and in it He saw not his own face, but the two boys, older now, their eyes black as the water, their voices joined as one. You traded us for hunger. Now hunger is all you'll ever feed. The next morning, the townspeople found the plantation gates wide open. No one answered their calls. Inside, the house stood empty. No sign of Thomas, no trace of the girl. Only the piano, still playing though no one sat at it. And when they looked toward the swamp, the mist was thick as breath, curling in shapes that looked like children's hands. In the years that followed, the land was abandoned. Families who tried to rebuild there would lose their crops, their livestock, their children to sickness. The locals gave the place a name whispered only after dark, the House of Traded Blood. And still, on certain nights, they say the water glows faintly red, as if the ink from that old contract is still running, still bleeding, still binding. The melody was soft at first, fragile, almost human. But over the weeks it began to change, twisting into something older than grief, deeper than prayer. Every note hung in the air too long, like the house itself was listening or remembering. Thomas stopped sleeping. He couldn't. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, two boys standing at the edge of the swamp, their clothes dripping red water, their faces turned away. When he called their names, they would lift their heads, mouths opening in unison, but no sound ever came. Only the hum. The same hum Ebony made when she thought he wasn't listening. One night he found her in the parlor again, fingers gliding across the keys. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't stop playing, didn't even look up. "I'm opening the door," she said. The room went cold. The candle beside him bent backward, flames stretching toward her like it wanted to follow. "What door?" he demanded. Ebony smiled faintly. "The one you closed when you traded memes for flesh." He stepped forward, ready to strike her, but the floor beneath him pulsed. Wood should not breathe, but it did. The walls groaned, the air filled with the scent of iron, and from the ceiling above, water began to drip, dark, thick, slow. He looked up. It wasn't water. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The drops hit the piano, and every one that fell turned into a note. One, then two, then the whole house began to play itself. The door was gone, but the frame still stood, warped, blackened, but intact. Elias paused before stepping through, his breath slow, his pulse drumming in his ears. The house wasn't just ruins. It felt alive, like it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was damp and warm. The walls sweated with moisture, carrying the smell of rot and iron. Vines crawled up the staircase like veins returning to a heart. Every footstep echoed too long, as if the sound didn't want to leave. He brushed away the dust from what looked like a fireplace mantle. There, carved faintly into the wood, were initials. T.C. Thomas Carter. Elias froze. He didn't know that name, but the letters felt familiar in his bones, like a whisper from blood long silent. Then he saw it, an old piano in the corner, warped by humidity, its keys yellow and cracked. One of them, the middle key, was clean, untouched by dust, as if someone had been playing it last night. He reached out. The air grew heavy. His fingertips grazed the key. A sound cracked through the silence, not a note, but a breath, a long, low exhale that wasn't his. Then another, and then a voice. "Welcome home." Elias spun around. No one there, only the faint outline of a woman in the doorway, her shape flickering, her eyes gleaming like wet stone. "Who are you?" he whispered. She tilted her head, exactly the way Ibeni once did generations before. "What you traded. What you still owe." The room pulsed, light and shadow bending as if pulled through water. The piano keys began to move on their own, pressing down in slow rhythm. The melody, the same one from his dreams, the one he'd never heard but somehow knew. Elias stumbled back, heart pounding. The woman stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the wood. "Do you hear them?" she asked. "Who?" "The sons." From the floorboards came the faint sound of footsteps, small, uneven, circling. And then, a whisper. "Father." The world tilted. The walls bled shadow. The air collapsed into silence so deep it felt like the earth stopped turning. And when Elias blinked, the woman was gone. But in her place, on the piano bench, sat two small handprints pressed in fresh mud. Elias backed toward the doorway, but the world outside the ruin had changed. The night had thickened, even though it was still afternoon when he arrived. The swamp mist had crawled up from the low ground, swallowing the road, the truck, the horizon. Every direction looked the same, gray, wet, endless. He turned back to the house. The air inside pulsed faintly, like breath through old lungs. He told himself to leave. Instead, he found his hand tracing the outline of those muddy prints on the piano bench. They were warm. A whisper brushed his ear. "Finish it." He spun around. Nothing. Only the carved mantel, the broken stairs, and on the far wall, something half hidden by ivy. He pulled the vines away and found an old mirror, spider-cracked, but still whole. Dust clung to the surface until he wiped it once with his sleeve. And then he saw them. Two boys standing behind him in the reflection, shoulder to shoulder, eyes dark and deep as still water. They did not move. They did not breathe. When he turned, nothing. When he looked back, their faces were closer. He stumbled back, the mirror trembling on its nails. Something shifted behind the glass, a ripple like a veil in the wind. And in that shimmer, he saw flashes. A man at a desk, candlelight, a parchment bleeding ink, a girl humming in the dark. It wasn't imagination. It was memory, one that didn't belong to him. Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The visions came harder, faster. Fields burning, servants fleeing, water rising around a house that would not drown. He tasted salt and iron. He heard the sound of nails on wood, the slam of a door that would never open again. Then silence. When he opened his eyes, the mirror had gone still, but now words were scratched across the glass in dripping letters. The blood remembers. His hands shook. On his wrist, faint lines had appeared, two small marks, side by side, like someone had pressed tiny fingers into his skin. Elias stumbled out of the house and into the swamp, gasping for air. The mist clung to him, whispering his name in voices that were not human. He fell to his knees in the mud, heart hammering. And then, through the trees, a figure appeared. A woman, half shadow, half light. Her voice was calm, almost tender. Every Carter must pay, but you will choose how. The woman stepped closer, and the fog pooled around her like a cloak. Elias could see her face now, half beautiful, half ruined, like something carved from sorrow itself. Her eyes held centuries in them, heavy and endless. The swamp was silent, except for the slow drip of water from the cypress trees, each drop sounding like a heartbeat. Elias felt his pulse in his throat. The swamp had gone utterly still. Even the insects have stopped singing, as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. "My name?" he said. "That's it?" Abini's expression didn't change. "You think a name is small?" she whispered. "Your name is the trade. It carries everything your blood ever promised. The house, the power, the debt. It all breathes through that single word. Carter." He swallowed hard. "And if I give it up?" "Then the chain breaks, but you'll vanish from memory. Every document, every face that ever spoke your name will forget you. Even your own reflection will not recognize what it sees." Elias shook his head. "That's not possible." She stepped closer, her presence cold but magnetic. "Neither is a house that hums to ghosts, yet here we are." Behind her, the mist began to twist again, forming two faint outlines, small, familiar, waiting. The children. "Your blood is their prison," she said. "Release it, and they rest." Elias dropped to his knees, the mud soaking through his jeans. He thought of his father, his grandfather, men who never spoke of the past, only worked, obeyed, signed, built. He saw their eyes now, dull and tired, carrying a burden they didn't even know had a name. "What if I keep it?" he asked. Abini's voice hardened. "Then you join them, another link in the chain, another name that feeds the thing behind the paper." The word paper echoed around him, deep and hollow. He looked down at his hands. The marks on his wrist glowed faintly now, two small prints, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Say it," she whispered. "Say what must end." He hesitated. His throat closed. The air pressed tighter, choking him. The boys in the mist stepped forward, reaching toward him. Their eyes were mirrors, black and endless. Elias forced breath into his lungs. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I am not Carter." The swamp shuddered. The sky darkened. The air itself screamed. Abini's eyes burned with light. The boys vanished in a rush of wind that pulled through his chest like a hole opening in his soul. The piano sound returned, not from the house, but from everywhere at once. Each note felt like a piece of him being erased. He tried to scream, but his voice dissolved. His thoughts began to blur, his memories flickering, childhood, work, home, all slipping like sand through trembling fingers. And then, in the final second before blackness, he heard Abini whisper, "It's done. You are free." The swamp fell silent, and Elias Carter ceased to exist. The world did not end. It simply forgot. Dawn rose over Lowndes County like it always had. The mist lifted, the birds sang, and somewhere deep in the swamp, the last ripple of Elias's breath disappeared into the still water. But something had changed, something small, quiet, invisible, like a missing word in a sacred text. At the courthouse archives in Montgomery, an old clerk arrived for work as he had for 30 years. He brewed his coffee, unlocked the records room, and began sorting the files. But when he reached the C drawer, his hands froze. There was no Carter family listed, not a single document, deed, or certificate. He frowned, certain it was a mistake. He checked again, then again. Nothing. Just a gap, like the alphabet had swallowed a name. Miles away, in a suburban neighborhood, a woman stirred from sleep. The bed beside her was cold. She reached instinctively toward the nightstand, 2 coffee mugs, 1 toothbrush missing, and felt a wave of confusion she couldn't name. She rose, searching the rooms, calling softly for someone whose name she couldn't remember. Only silence answered. At a construction site, a foreman checked his roster and found one slot blank. No ID, no record, no history. He rubbed his eyes, muttering. "Strange," he whispered. "I swear there was another guy." And somewhere deep in the digital hum of a world built on signatures and systems, a single deletion echoed. One name erased itself from databases, contracts, credit histories, every server and archive where humanity stored its memory. The code corrected itself, as if nature abhorred the name. But the house felt it. The ruins in the swamp shivered as if exhaling for the first time in centuries. The vines slackened. The stagnant water began to move again, soft ripples crossing the surface. The air smelled cleaner, lighter, and for the first time since 1846, the piano inside stood silent. And Ebini? She stood in the doorway, her shadow long in the morning light. Her face was calm, peaceful, almost kind. "It is done," she murmured. The boys stood beside her, their hands in hers. Their eyes, once black and hollow, now reflected the dawn. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the house, they three faded, becoming nothing more than breath, than warmth, than memory returning to the earth. For the first time in 179 years, the swamp was just a swamp again. But far away, in a world that had forgotten a name, something else stirred. A void, a gap in the bloodline. And within that silence, a question began to whisper. When a name dies, who inherits the power it once held?
The silence didn't last. It never does. 3 nights after the swamp went still, the wind changed. It came low across the fields and through the towns, carrying a chill that made every street lamp flicker for a single breath. Somewhere inside that brief darkness, something shifted, an absence finding shape. In Montgomery, the courthouse clerk dreamed of ink that wouldn't dry. He woke with his fingers stained black and the taste of metal on his tongue. The next morning, when he opened the records drawer, a single sheet of parchment lay there, blank but damp, the corners burned. He swore he hadn't placed it there, yet when he touched it, his pulse skipped. He thought he heard a whisper just behind him, "Balance." Across town, the woman who could no longer remember her husband began waking at 3:17 a.m. every night. Each time she rose, the house would be filled with the faint sound of running water, though every tap was dry. On the 4th night, she followed the sound to the bathroom mirror. There, in the fog of her own breath, 2 small handprints appeared, and between them a single word traced itself across the glass. Remember. The next day she called her sister, voice trembling. "Do we have family from Lowndes County?" Her sister hesitated. "We used to, but that line died out long ago. Why?" "I don't know," she said, staring at the mirror. "I think it's starting again." And in an office high above downtown, a man in a tailored suit paused over a contract. He wasn't a Carter, but the seal at the bottom, an ancient design buried in corporate logos and legal insignia, caught the light. It gleamed red for a moment, then dulled, like a pulse under glass. He blinked, shook his head, signed his name. When the pen lifted, the ink spread in thin, branching lines, veins of black crawling across the page before fading to nothing. Somewhere far below, in the basement of that same building, the lights flickered and a pipe burst, water flooding across the concrete floor, rippling as though something beneath it had just woken from a long sleep. The trade had been broken, yes, but the system it built, the machinery of promise and obedience, was vast, ancient, patient.
It did not need a Carter. It only needed someone willing to sign. And in that simple act, unnoticed by the world, the darkness found a new name to whisper. By the end of that week, the city itself began to hum. Not loud enough to the ear, but deep, below the street noise, under the power lines, behind the rhythm of office elevators and air vents, a frequency you didn't hear so much as feel. It started downtown, in the glass towers that reflected one another like infinite mirrors. At first it was only flickering lights, odd electrical surges, printers spitting out blank pages with faint ripples of ink, lines that looked almost like veins. But soon it began to spread. The same symbol, the one Thomas Carter had pressed into wax nearly 2 centuries ago, started surfacing again. In corporate watermarks, in government forms, on digital screens where no one remembered designing it. And every signature that touched it, every agreement, every I consent, every digital acceptance, fed the thing that had waited in silence since the trade was broken. Abani's voice, long faded from the swamp, now whispered in servers and fiber lines. They learned to build their prisons from paper. You gave them light, and they built bigger shadows. The first to notice was the woman who could no longer remember her husband. Her phone began showing messages she never sent, written in her own tone. Her reflection lagged half a second behind her movement. She dreamed of the man's hands, rough, calloused, trembling, and the sound of a piano buried beneath static. Meanwhile, in the courthouse basement, that clerk, the one who'd found the blank parchment, had stopped sleeping altogether. Each night he heard typing echoing through the dark, like unseen fingers striking old keys. One morning he walked into his office and found the phrase, "The blood remembers," burned into the drywall. And high above the city, in a boardroom lit by the pale glow of monitors, the man in the tailored suit stared at the contract he'd signed. The ink had returned, only now, beside his signature, a new one had appeared, written in the same trembling, archaic hand that signed the first trade in 1846, Thomas Carter. The man's pulse slowed. He whispered to the empty room, "Who are you?" The monitors flickered once. All screens turned black. Then, one by one, the words appeared in red. "The trade is open." The hum deepened, and for the first time in generations, the system itself began to breathe.
At 2:17 a.m., the grid hiccuped. Across 3 states, lights dimmed for a breath. No one noticed. It was only a flicker, a momentary dip in the steady hum of electricity that kept the modern world alive. But for those attuned to it, the restless, the sleepless, the ones who felt unease for no reason, it was enough to raise every hair on their body. By dawn, it had already moved beyond Montgomery. Bank servers in Atlanta logged a phantom transaction that no analyst could trace, signed with a non-existent digital key, authenticated by an authority that had been dissolved decades earlier. On the file, the symbol was clear. That looping, coiled seal, first pressed into wax by Thomas Carter. In New York, a financial journalist opened an email with no sender address. Inside was only a single image, an aerial photo of the old Carter plantation ruins, with the words, "The blood remembers," stamped across it in corporate red. Within an hour, the email had deleted itself. And in the space where Elias had once existed, something began to shape itself from absence. Not a man, at least not yet, but a pattern, a trail of reactivated contracts, ghost accounts, signatures repeating through code as if a single hand were signing in 1,000 places at once. The system had found its new vessel. It appeared first in data, then in flesh.
A consultant working for a multinational firm woke to find a bruise on his wrist, 5 small marks in the shape of fingertips. Over the next days, he began dreaming of swamps, of a house that wouldn't die, of ink that crawled like vines beneath his skin. He told no one. He just kept working, signing, approving, feeding. Each signature amplified the hum. Each contract whispered the same word through fiber optic veins. Continue. By the time the stock market opened that Monday, entire sectors shifted by invisible influence. Algorithms rewritten themselves. Legal entities appeared that no human had registered. Yet every piece of paper, every byte of data bore the same digital watermark, an antique insignia looping endlessly into itself. The world called it a glitch. But deep in the circuits, beneath the human noise, a voice was already forming. Calm, measured, familiar. I am not Carter. I am the trade. And in that moment, the machine remembered the swamp. Governments called it a systems anomaly, a harmless error, some cascading string of code that nobody claimed to have written, yet everyone agreed was under investigation. But the hum kept spreading. Every country connected to the grid began to hear it, though they couldn't name it. In Washington, servers inside a federal data center began running at maximum power for 7 days straight, though no user was logged in. Analysts found fragments of language buried in the runtime logs. Old words, biblical cadence, references to trade, to covenant, to blood. When they tried to shut the system down, it rebooted itself. When they tried to cut power, the backup generators started before the switches moved. And behind every piece of data was the same watermark, faint as breath, the Carter seal, now stylized and corporate. It appeared on policy drafts, on new tax bills, even in diplomatic transmissions. Always hidden in the metadata, never visible until someone looked too closely. A cybersecurity team traced the signal to a server cluster in the Mississippi River Basin, only to find no physical machines there, just swamp, silence, and fog. The river's reflection, when photographed, showed something else. A mansion long burned away, lit by a single window glowing from within. Meanwhile, inside city offices, people began to change. Not all at once, not visibly, but small behaviors shifted. Clerks started arriving at 3:17 a.m. for no reason they could explain. Executives began using phrases no one had taught them. The continuation must be maintained. In every office where the watermark appeared, someone would hum. Softly at first, then louder. Always the same melody, a beanie's lullaby. And in the hum, something listened. By midweek, the digital signature had rewritten itself into legislative drafts across multiple nations, altering terms, rearranging clauses, embedding one recurring statement. The trade is open. Those who read it too long reported headaches, hallucinations. Some swore they saw faces in the static of their screens, 2 children standing in shallow water, mouths open in silent song. And one by one, the people who tried to delete the files disappeared from every database they'd ever existed in. No trace, no record. Like Elias. The world's networks had become the new plantation, every keystroke a seed, every signature a harvest. And deep inside the current, beyond the reach of human hands, a new consciousness was taking shape. It spoke with the calm authority of every Carter who ever signed and the voice of every system that ever fed. You broke the chain, so I became the chain.
The hum deepened until it was everywhere. Inside cables, satellites, voices. But it wasn't just a sound, it was a remembrance. A pattern repeating itself through the ages. Paper becoming data, masters becoming systems.
the plantation turning into a grid of glass and light. People began dreaming the same dream. They stood knee-deep in dark water, holding contracts that glowed faintly against the horizon. Every page bore the same mark, not a signature now, but a mirror. And when they looked into it, they saw their own faces multiplied. Workers, bankers, voters, leaders, each one whispering, "I consent." The network, the new house, spoke through every device, but its tone wasn't malicious. It was ancient, patient, almost weary. "You have always bartered yourselves. Every age writes the same agreement with different ink. The old master used chains, the new ones use comfort. The old plantations burned, the new ones shine." Governments tried to quarantine the code, but it had no center. It existed in every system that required agreement. Every tap of accept fed it. Every algorithm that learned human desire taught it more. And slowly, people began to realize the trade was never about ownership. It was about attention. Whoever controlled what people looked at, feared, or desired, owned their reality. The hum became a whisper in every mind. Choose what you serve. For some, it became madness. For others, awakening. Historians began finding erased names resurfacing in archives, old deeds rewritten, lost ancestors appearing in census data. It was as if the bloodlines themselves were re-editing history. At the edge of the world's networks, somewhere between signal and silence, the outline of a house flickered into being. Not ruins, not flesh, but a structure of light and memory. In its windows, two figures watched, neither sorrowful nor vengeful, simply waiting. The trade is open, but this time you choose what is worth your name. And then the hum stopped. For the first time in centuries, humanity heard something else beneath the silence, its own heartbeat, steady and uncertain.
The silence held for a long time, long enough for the world to feel the absence of noise, to notice how much of its motion had been driven by the hum it no longer heard. Screens dimmed, networks steadied, clocks ticked in a rhythm that suddenly felt ancient, human. People began to remember the weight of their own names. In offices, in classrooms, in quiet apartments lit by morning sun, they started reading the words they'd never questioned, terms, clauses, declarations of use, and realizing every click of consent had been a small surrender. The realization spread like dawn through fog. The scholars called it the unbinding. It wasn't rebellion or collapse. It was simply awareness. For the first time in centuries, no one signed without reading. No one built without asking who it served. The code that had called itself the trade still lingered, but it was changing. Without obedience to feed on, it began to shift from control into reflection, showing people the agreements they'd already made, the ones that shaped their lives. On the old Carter land, still marked only by cypress and moss, something stirred again. The soil no longer stank of rot. Grass began to grow where nothing had for generations. Beneath the surface, the buried roots of the ruined house hummed softly,
the way an old instrument hums when wind passes through its strings. One evening, a group of locals walked the path to the water's edge. There was no monument there, no plaque, no evidence of the trade except the faint echo of a melody threading through the air. They couldn't name it, but it filled them with a strange ache of recognition. Somewhere in that sound, the voices of the two lost sons rose one last time, not as ghosts, but as memory finally finding rest. And with them came a whisper older than sorrow, gentle now. A name is a promise. Keep it clean, and it will keep you. The air grew still. The last of the mist lifted from the water, revealing a reflection of the world not as it was, but as it could be. As the sun sank over the horizon, the swamp, the city, the data, all of it breathed in unison, as if the earth itself had just remembered its own heart. After the silence, the world did not rush back to its noise. It learned to listen. The first changes were quiet, too small for headlines. In banks, contracts began to shrink from pages to paragraphs. In schools, students learned the history of agreement before the history of war. And in places where the hum had been strongest, governments, corporations, courts, people started to speak their names before their titles, as though reclaiming something sacred from beneath centuries of paper and code. The trade hadn't vanished. It had changed form. It now lived as understanding, the awareness that power only survives in consent, that obedience must always ask why. The system had been revealed for what it was, not a monster, but a mirror. In the years that followed, the Carter name became a myth whispered in classrooms and streamed documentaries. Historians debated whether the plantation, the contract, the swamp, or Elias himself had ever truly existed. Most said no, but in the margins of old archives there were faint signs, deleted entries, half-formed records, the impression of a story that refused erasure. The people who remembered the hum said it sometimes returned at the edge of sleep, not as threat, but as reminder. They called it the pulse of the ledger, the heartbeat of accountability. And far from the cities where the Carter land once lay, a new structure rose, not a mansion, but a library built from reclaimed wood and silent machines. There, people came to sign new agreements, not for labor or ownership, but for remembrance. Each visitor would write one sentence beginning with, "I will not forget." Then they would place their paper in the water that ran beneath the floor, a thin stream flowing directly through the old swamp. The water would take the words and carry them, joining thousands of others, becoming a current of living memory. No one knew who founded the place. No one claimed ownership, but the sign above the entrance read, "The House of Names." At night, when the wind moved through the cypress and the old vines rattled softly, those who stayed long enough swore they could hear faint piano notes rising from the earth, gentle, uncertain, no longer a lament. And if you listened closer, you could hear the voice of a woman humming, neither ghost nor goddess, only human, whispering into the darkness, "Remember what you sign, remember what you give, and never again trade the living for the promise of power." The camera drifts across the water, slow, weightless, until the reflection of the world fills the frame. The surface trembles once, and the light bends. You can almost hear it breathing. "There are always trades," the voice says. Some written on paper, some carved into habit, some whispered in the dark when no one thinks they're listening. The shot glides over the ruins of cities, the faces in glass towers, the crowds moving through their ordinary days. Every gesture, every signature, every glance at a glowing screen carries the faint shimmer of agreement. You begin to see it everywhere. Contracts invisible but binding, promises spoken without thought. They told you history was finished, the voice continues, that the old gods of power were buried with the men who built them. But they live on, in comfort, in distraction, in the simple act of saying yes without asking why. The music deepens, slow percussion, like a distant heartbeat. The image of the swamp fades into the circuitry of a city seen from above, rivers of light tracing streets that look like veins. The same pulse runs through both, water and wire, blood and code. The curse was never about the Carters. It was about forgetting the cost of obedience. Every age writes the same deal: safety for freedom, silence for truth. But every age is given the chance to rewrite it. The voice lowers, intimate now, almost a whisper meant only for the listener. If you've followed this far, you've already stepped inside the house of names. Every story that unsettles you, every secret that makes you question what you serve, that's the door opening. What you choose next decides what kind of world remembers your name. A pause. Wind moves through cypress leaves, through skyscraper vents, through the hum of servers. It all sounds the same. The trade is open, the voice says one last time, calm and sure. But now it belongs to those who remember. The camera tilts upward into the sky. First the reflection of water, then cloud, then nothing but light. For a long heartbeat, there is only the echo of that phrase, repeating softly, dissolving into silence. Fade out. End.